Velkommen alle sammen. Dette det andre foredraget i serien Andre verdenskrig, gjensyn og dypdykk, som vi har her på Litteraturhuset i Oslo. Det Universitetet i Tromsø, Norges arktiske universitet, og HL-senteret, Senter for studier av holocaust og livssynsminoriteter, som holder dette sammen. Og vi generelt støttet av Eckbos legat. Vi hadde bare for få uker siden, 2 uker siden, Richard Overy her. Tonight it's Maria Fritsche. We have decided to switch a little bit between Norwegian and English today, and we open up after Maria's lecture for the questions and commentaries in Norwegian if you want to, and we can translate. Maria does actually speak and talk Norwegian very well, but she would prefer to give the lecture in English. I should repeat that the next one will be October 24th. Then it's Ole Jørgen Moe, førsteamanuensis. Han snakker om apokalyptens tid, luftmakt under andre verdenskrig. Utrolig sentralt og viktig tema. Overordnet. Så 21. november snakker Anton Weiss-Wendt om masseforbrytelsene av nazistene og politikken bak FNs folkemordskonvensjon. Altså, da går han fra 1944 og inn i 48, da går vi inn i etterkrigstiden, og vi topper denne serien, må vi si, med Deborah Lipstadt, som kommer og skal snakke om Eichmann-saken. This is the text in Norwegian. Maria's text in English is the ordinary amidst extraordinary encounters between the occupier and occupied in Europe. And she sent an email where she explained that whereas the attack by the German Wehrmacht signaled the beginning of the tremendous hardships, persecution and loss for millions of Europeans, for others, especially in Northern and Western Europe, daily life continued much the same. How was daily life under the German occupation in these regions? Can we speak of a normality of occupation? And what role did violence play? In a talk, Fritsche looks at occupation from below, asking how people responded to the presence of German soldiers and how the soldiers, in turn, adapted to their role as occupiers. This was the process. By shifting the focus on contacts between the occupiers and the occupied, Fritsche demonstrates that there is still much to be learned about the Second World War. And Maria Fritsche, she just came from Germany because this fall she is a visiting fellow at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. Else she is professor at our friends and colleagues at the Department for Historical Studies at NTNU in Trondheim. She's both a historian and a film historian. Fritsche is writing a book now, I hope, but she told me she spent a lot of time on this lecture for the beginning of the semester, but she will write a book on the mundanity of war. And she has published extensively on film and cinema, justice, military, masculinity, with a focus on the Second World War and the post-war period. Her most recent monograph, the American Marshall Plan film campaign and the Europeans, has just been published as a paperback. There is some food and drinks here, so if you go, you can absolutely walk during the lecture, but please be quiet. And afterwards, we are so lucky because we are cooperating with Universitetet Tromsø that my colleague, the last time it was Tom Christiansen, who is actually a co-founder of this series with me, and the Holocaust Center, Professor Halvard Kjellmeland, who's leading the discussion. And we are actually asked a couple of colleagues here to start out with commentaries, but we will open for the public also for questions and answer and comments. But Maria, now it's you. Welcome so much.
Han gjør det. Ja. So you switched my PowerPoint. Takk for den hyggelige introduksjonen, og takk, jeg fikk lov for å snakke på engelsk. Jeg tror det blir litt bedre når jeg snakker på engelsk. So the ordinary amidst the extraordinary. In his book, French and German, the eminent British historian Richard Cobb presented an intriguing chronicle of life under German occupation in France and Belgium. With attention to detail and a critical eye, COP shows how people maneuvered through the occupation. The choices these people made seldom fell neatly into the categories of resistance or collaboration. In my talk today, I'm going to discuss how German occupation affected European societies and how people responded to the upheavals the occupation produced. In the second part, I will focus on the encounters between the occupiers and the occupied on the everyday levels. So when we think of relations between the occupiers and the occupied, the first image that comes to our mind is that of women with German soldiers. Yet relations between the occupier and the occupied took many different forms. For example, here we have a picture of Norwegian workers drinking beer together with a German soldier. Very few pictures of these actually exist. As Kopp phrased it, the relations between the occupiers and the occupied were obscured, twisted, and complicated by all sorts of nuances of personal relationships, ranging from complete mutual trust to jarring acrimony. When Europeans speak of life under German occupation, they speak of very different things. For some, as Yuri said, life did not really change that much under occupation. For others, it represented a drastic event that cut deep wounds. For people living on the territory of the Soviet Union, the German occupation constituted a relatively short period of suppression and terror, succeeded and preceded by long phases of communist terror. Other regions had experienced a German occupation before, during the First World War. The inhabitants of Belgium and northeastern France, for example, recognized the same patterns from the First World War, except that this time the German soldiers behaved a little bit better and were more disciplined than their predecessors. So what was normal life like under occupation? It seems strange to think of occupation and war in terms of normality. Could something akin to a normal life actually exist in the context of war and occupation? After all, war and occupation caused considerable upheaval. Even communities which were not subjected to brutal raids or bombing were touched by the violent nature of occupation. So what constitutes normality? The character of normality usually only reveals itself when something out of the ordinary happens. Normality is the condition we do not pay attention to, because we have become accustomed to it. Actions and events that are habitual, repetitive, predictable, are perceived as normal. And most people get fairly quickly accustomed to new structures or behaviors. Something that might have seemed inconceivable or outrageous can become the norm if it reoccurs on a regular basis. Thus, even prisoners in a Nazi concentration camp who lived under the most atrocious conditions could experience normality. That is a routine they had become accustomed to. The daily roll call in the morning, the thin soup, the march to work, even the standing to attention for hours in the freezing cold, or the arbitrary beatings by the guards became routine. So when we speak of the normal, that is ordinary, everyday life under German occupation, we need to use the plural form. There existed very different normalities of occupation. The experiences of occupation varied greatly from one country to the other. German occupation policy differed considerably in the degree of repression and exploitation. Now, these differences were partly a result of Nazi ideology and its racial hierarchy, which categorized some populations as worthy and others as inferior and expendable. They were also the result of Nazi Germany's strategic, economic, and political goals, which differed from one part of Europe to the other. And it was influenced by the administrative competition between different authorities, which all pursued their own agenda. German occupation policy was also shaped by the social, ethnic, and even geographic conditions. The German authorities exploited social or ethnic tensions and granted some groups privileges to enlist their support. Not least was occupation policy impacted by military needs and by the developments of the war, as we know. Of course, there existed also similarities. The scarcity of commodities, especially food, as well as repression and violence, characterized German occupation all over Europe. Yet they affected occupied societies differently. If we look at the use of violence and repression, we find a clear divide between Eastern Europe and the Balkans on the one hand, and Western and Northern Europe on the other hand. Although there existed, of course, considerable variations within these two halves, Nazi rule was significantly more brutal in Eastern Europe, as you all know, already from the very beginning. People here were subjected to systematic and arbitrary violence, to ruthless exploitation of the economy and the people, and the vandalizing of land and property. The rules of military occupation are defined by international law, such as the Hague Convention of 1907. According to Article 43 of the Hague Convention, the occupying power has the duty, I quote, to restore and to ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety, while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force of the country. It also had to respect the rights and lives of people, as well as their private property, according to Article 46. Nazi Germany violated these stipulations in multiple ways. For example, through its strategy to punish innocent civilians for the death of German soldiers. In Serbia and Greece, the Wehrmacht systematically raided villages, killed innocent civilians, or sent them to concentration camps as reprisal for partisan attacks or for acts of sabotage. General Franz Böhme, who for 2.5 months acted as commander of Serbia in autumn 1941, ordered the execution of more than 11,000 civilians during his short tenure in Serbia. These victims, often Jews or communists, were killed in revenge for attacks on the Wehrmacht. The ratio was 100 civilians for a German soldier, sometimes 500 or even 1,000. Of course, the Germans also resorted to hostage killings here in Norway and even more often in France, yet these remained exceptions. In Serbia and in Greece, they were the rule. Also, Nazi Germany's recruitment of forced labor differed considerably across Europe. In Norway and Denmark, for instance, drafted workers were not sent to Germany. They were needed here. In contrast, French, Belgian, and Dutch citizens were recruited to work in Germany. Voluntary service was soon replaced by compulsory service. In the Netherlands, the Germans even conducted raids on companies to capture workers for the Arbeitseinsatz from 1942 onwards. Now, force and violence were applied much earlier in Poland. Because the numbers of workers who volunteered to work in Germany remained small, the German authorities employed ever more aggressive recruitment practices. From 1942 onwards, the recruitment of labor was laid into the hands of Fritz Sauckel. He was Generalbevollmächtigter für den Arbeitseinsatz. Now here, recruitment developed into literal manhunts, at which is interesting, also private recruitment agencies participated who had been hired by German industrialists. People in the Soviet territories were snatched from the streets. They were rounded up and deported. On the 1st of March 1944, Sauckel conceded that less than 200,000 of the 5 million foreign workers in Germany at the time had come voluntarily. The majority of these forced laborers came from Eastern Europe. Now, the differences in Nazi occupation policies are also evident in the occupiers' willingness to guarantee the safety of the people. For it was not only the Germans' use of violence, which varied from one part to another, but also the protection from violence. According to the Hague Convention, it is the duty of the military power to ensure the safety of the population in the occupied territories and to prosecute crimes according to the rules of law. Under Nazi rule, however, the German military courts often refrained from taking action, or military jurisdiction was bypassed, as it happened in the Soviet Union, in Greece, or in Serbia. As a result, civilians accused of an offense were not tried by a court, but were immediately liquidated or deported without a trial. The absence of a proper judiciary power which followed the rules of law also meant that many crimes against inhabitants of the occupied territories went unpunished. To be sure, the Wehrmacht and the SS took drastic actions against any form of disobedience or criticism within the Wehrmacht. Around 30,000 German soldiers were sentenced to death, most of them for desertion or for subverting the war effort through critical remarks, jokes, or self-mutilation. But at the same time, the German courts stationed in Eastern and Southern Europe showed considerable leniency towards crimes committed by Wehrmacht soldiers against the civilian population. German soldiers were often allowed to loot and steal with impunity, as long as it did not threaten the military discipline. Physical or sexual assaults on civilians, too, were treated with leniency. This state of lawlessness in occupied Eastern Europe impacted the conduct of German soldiers against civilians. Where the use of arbitrary violence against civilians is the norm, and the danger to be punished low, brutal force is more frequently used to obtain a goal. This increased the power of individual soldiers and left the civilian population in an even more fragile situation. In the West, and by this I mean also in Northern Europe, the German authorities displayed greater willingness to ensure the safety of the population. Soldiers who committed crimes against civilians were usually tried by a court and punished. The fact that civilians in these regions regularly reported offenses committed by Wehrmacht personnel indicates a certain level of trust in German authorities. As a result, people also behaved differently towards representatives of the occupying forces. They were able to rebuff demands and call on the authorities for help. They had what social historians call agency. In Norway, the dominant view of the occupying soldiers is that of nice, decent men who behaved fairly well towards the Norwegians. And this positive image of the disciplined German soldier is not a myth, although it's perhaps a little bit embellished. The conduct of the German soldiers in Norway was a result of a fairly rigorous persecution of socially offenses against civilians, combined with successful propaganda, which presented the Norwegians as racially equals and as friends rather than enemies. However, part of this image is that German soldiers who committed violence against Norwegians, particularly sexual violence against Norwegian women, were punished harshly, often by death. Now, I found no confirmation for this claim in my sources, which are military courts. Yes, cases of sexual assaults were investigated, but the sentences were fairly lenient. And the same is true for sexual violence committed by Germans against German women. This leniency was not specific to Nazi Germany, but result of dominant contemporary views which regarded sexual violence as a minor crime, and which treated female victims often with suspicion. We can find differences in other aspects of German occupation too, differences which had a considerable and long-term impact on these societies. And this concerns, for instance, German schooling policy, which differed vastly in Eastern and Western Europe. In Western Europe, the school system remained by and large in place. Most children, except for Jewish children, could continue to go to school throughout the war. Not so in Eastern Europe. Here, Nazi policy prescribed that the Slav population should only receive the most primary education. Only 4th-grade or maximum 5th-grade elementary schools were permitted. And in practice, even many of these rudimentary schools remained closed for long periods or for the whole duration of the occupation. Teachers had fled or had been killed. There were only Soviet books available. And the schools were often far away, making it impossible to reach them. So only half of all children in German-occupied Soviet territories, as Dieter Pohl has outlined, were able to attend school during the Second World War. For the children, the war years were in many ways lost years. Another central aspect of the occupation was food. War and occupation exacerbated the food situation in all occupied countries. The Allied blockade cut off the nations from import and trade. Large quantities of resources were requisitioned and redirected for military use. The Nazi leadership's strategy to deport, resettle, and exterminate millions of people further disrupted farming and production, as did the destruction of communities, industry, and farmland. Almost all people, also those living in the German Reich, were affected by the scarcity of food. However, they were affected to different degrees. As you all know, those who suffered most were those who ranked lowest on the National Socialist racial hierarchy and were cut off from society: the Jews in the closed ghettos and the Soviet prisoners of war. The average daily food ration for Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto was reduced to around 180 calories a day in 1941. 180 calories a day, that's about 2 large apples. The daily food ration for a German adult was around 2,500 calories a day at the time. About 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, most because of starvation and diseases related to undernourishment. The aim of the infamous hunger plan, drafted by the Reichsminister for Food, Herbert Backe, was to feed the entire German military off the land in the Soviet Union. The starvation of millions of Soviet citizens formed part of this calculation. The plan was implemented with the attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 and resulted in the death of approximately 4.2 million Soviets. People also hungered in other parts of occupied Europe, most notably in Greece, where around 250,000 Greeks died as a result of famine between 1941 and 1943. Even in the Netherlands, people stood at the brink of starvation in winter 1944 to 1945. However, at the beginning of the war, when the Wehrmacht troops invaded Poland, France, or Norway, they found that the shops were still filled to the brink with goods. Goods that had already been rationed in Germany. The soldiers went on veritable spending sprees, buying everything they could lay their hands on and sending it home to their wives and families. The Nazi and Wehrmacht leadership sanctioned and facilitated these buying orgies, even though they were hugely detrimental to the local economies and put a strain on the food supply in the occupied territories. Yet allowing the soldiers to buy goods cheaply, thanks to a highly inflated currency, was, as Götz Ali argued in his book Volksstaat, a means to garner popular support amongst the Germans. Similar to the Aryanization of Jewish property, which also benefited the ordinary Germans, it helped to cushion the negative effects of military spending and economic decline. Now, the people in the occupied territories reacted differently to the eager German buyers. Many shop owners, farmers, and innkeepers welcomed the new customers and made a fine profit. Others perceived the soldiers as the main cause for the food shortages and rationing. Court records are a rich source to get a sense of the tensions the increasing scarcity of commodities created in society, as this incident illustrates. On the morning of the 3rd of November 1940, a German engineer who worked for the Wehrmacht in Kirkenes passed by 3 Norwegian workers in the port. One of them, the carpenter Reidar Johnsen, walked up to the German and told him, "Habe ich keine Milch? Habe ich kleines Kind, nicht ein Jahr alt? I have no milk. I have a small child which is not even 1 year old." The German replied he should go to the Kommandantur with his complaint. And this obviously angered Johnsen, who had been drinking heavily the night before, as the court protocol stated. He shouted, "Du trinkst meine Milch," and punched him in the face. Now, the military command took immediate action that very same day, which is quite unusual. Johnsen was tried and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The judgment was publicized through posters in Norwegian and in German. I found this in neatly folded poster in the court records. And the milk crisis was serious in Kirkenes at that time. To suppress similar reactions, the military reacted with harsh punishment and followed up with articles in the local newspapers which explained the real reason for the shortages of milk. It was not the German soldiers, these articles explained, it was the shortage in hay. So it had nothing to do with the Germans. So how did the Germans stationed in these countries react to the widespread destitution they encountered? Some soldiers felt empathy with the people and shared their rations with their hosts, if they were billeted in private homes, or children in the streets. Some used their rations of cigarettes and alcohol to endear themselves, especially to local women. Others exploited the high demand for goods to make a profit on the booming black market. If we look at letters soldiers sent home, we find that many were simply indifferent to the plight of the people. They accepted the lower rations for civilians in the occupied territories and even the starvation of the population in the east as a natural side effect of the occupation and war. An Austrian soldier who was stationed in the Ukraine wrote to his mother about the chicken he and his comrades had confiscated from the impoverished local peasants. He described to her the anger in the eyes of the people whose chicken he had stolen, and his glee at having captured it for himself. His letters show no sign of empathy or reflection over his own role. Instead, it expresses disgust for the squalid conditions of the peasants and finds that the soldiers have a natural right to their produce and livestock. The attitudes of the soldiers illustrate the considerable extent to which ordinary Germans embraced Nazi propaganda. In such circumstances, no dialogue was possible. Although many people living under German occupation were preoccupied with struggling to survive, many others, especially in the West and in the North, experienced occupation as a rather mundane affair. Soldiers who were stationed in Norway complained about the tediousness of life. Some were longing for adventure, wanted to prove themselves at the front, especially in the early phase of the war when Nazi Germany went from victory to victory and they were not there. Many civilians shared the sense of boredom. Curfews and need for permits limited movement. The streets and cities were dark as a result of the blackout. In some countries, like in Norway, the Germans had confiscated most radio sets, cutting off people not only from information, but also from entertainment and music. What is more, alcohol and food were rationed and difficult to obtain, leaving the people with little means of diversion. People stayed at home, or they made use of those opportunities that were still open to them. Cinema attendance increased massively during the Second World War, both in Nazi Germany and in occupied Europe. Also in Eastern Europe, cinemas remained in operation throughout the war. These cinemas often reflected the deep societal splits which German occupation had produced or exacerbated. In the Polish city of Krakow or the Czech city of Brno, some film theaters catered to the tastes of Volksdeutsche, whereas other cinemas showed films for Poles or Czech. Some cinemas offered a mixed fare of films produced by Nazi Germany and its allies, while others played only non-German films. The cinemas offered entertainment and warmth. Although soldiers had access to Soldatenkinos, like in these pictures, so cinemas which were reserved for soldiers only, they often preferred to attend regular cinemas, if they had the chance. For cinema provided escape, a temporary escape from the tediousness of military life and from the tiring presence of comrades. Cinema's appeal lies in that it offers an illusion of being elsewhere, an illusion of escape to a more glamorous or a more normal life. The cinema was also a space where the occupiers and the occupied could meet without being seen. The civilians encountered the occupiers on the screen, in the form of film, as well as inside the theater. Now, this proximity could result in conflicts. In the safety of darkness, some people dared to express criticism. Or they clashed with German visitors. In Trondheim, the proprietor of a cinema divided the auditorium with a rope into a German and into a Norwegian section to prevent clashes. Yet at the same time, this proximity facilitated closer contacts. German soldiers and civilians found themselves seated next to each other, close enough to be touched accidentally or on purpose. And just as important as the physical proximity was the shared experience of watching the same film and of perhaps reacting the same way to what was being shown on screen. Also, this constituted a normality of the occupation. What brings people together? What tears them apart? German occupation produced tremendous political, economic, and social upheavals. Societies were turned upside down. New hierarchies of power replaced the old ones. And even within a society, occupation was experienced very differently. It is important to remember that the occupation did not just curb individual freedom and reduce agency, it also provided new opportunities to some. How and to which extent people made use of these opportunities was again dependent on a number of factors. How occupation was experienced and how people related to the occupier was also influenced, for example, by gender, by age, by class, as well as, of course, by ideological views or religion. Children were often the first who made contact with the soldiers. They also acted as door opener, facilitating contacts with the natives and easing tensions. You could talk about children. It was not political. And even if the parents forbid the children to go near the soldiers, curiosity and the lure of sweets was difficult to withstand. In many cases, it was children who acted as translators or language teachers for the soldiers, picking up the foreign language fairly quickly. Experiences could also differ considerably between people living in the cities and on the countryside. If we look at the food situation, we find that during the war, people in the countryside were generally better off than their fellow countrymen in the cities. Farmers who worked their own land had more opportunity to divert produce from the occupiers. This provided the farmers with an additional source of income. It also increased their power and their status, as the hungry city dwellers were dependent on the farmers' goodwill to share their food. And this, of course, also produced tensions between the rural population and the city dwellers. Moreover, the different experience of the occupation could influence the views on the occupier. In a report from November 1941, Polish Vice Consul Chilinski reported that the Polish peasants had been, I quote, far better off than any other class in Poland in the first 5 months of the German occupation. The starved city paid high prices for food, and many peasants, quote, were inclined to look with favor on the Germans. However, the situation changed radically already in spring 1940, when the German authorities reduced prices, introduced strict quotas, and began to recruit peasants by force. Many had to flee their farms. So rationing affected social groups differently. Those with means or good connections to people in powerful positions, as always, were able to acquire goods despite the strained situation. Also, gender played a role in the distribution of rations. Tobacco and alcohol rations, if available at all, were smaller for women than for men. In Norway, men could buy up to 160 cigarettes per month. In 1942, women only 80. In 1943, this ration was further reduced to 2 cigarettes per day for men and 1 cigarette per day for women. Yet food rationing affected women's lives in another regard. In all occupied societies, it was the women's task to stand in line to obtain the meager family rations. Now, this could last for hours every day and came in addition to all the other jobs. Women thus had to use considerable part of the day just to obtain food, queuing for food, growing vegetables, traveling to the countryside to barter. And it also fell upon women to turn the meager rations, often low-quality substitutes, into a filling meal. In countries where people lived at the brink of starvation, desperate women also resorted to sexual intercourse with soldiers to obtain something to eat for themselves or for their children. The British information officer Norman Lewis, who participated in the liberation of Naples in October 1943, offers a glimpse into the sober reality of occupation in his diary. He observed how Allied soldiers, we're talking about Allied soldiers here, after having received their tins of rations, entered a large building. Out of curiosity, he followed them and found a long row of Italian women sitting apathetically by the wall, offering sex in exchange for a tin of food. Some soldiers had seized the opportunity, as the stack of tins next to some women indicated, while others turned away in disgust. One can imagine that similar scenarios took place under German occupation. Of course, all the soldiers were affected by the rationing, but they had privileged access to food and higher rations. Moreover, their status gave them the power to obtain commodities through other channels. So German occupation altered societal structures. In many occupied territories, it was particularly the ratio between men and women which changed drastically, with considerable consequences. In France, for example, 2 million men were in captivity in Germany throughout the war. Almost 500,000 Dutch and a similar number of Belgians worked in Germany, mostly men. The number of forced laborers who were deported from Poland and the Soviet territories amounted to 3.5 million. But here, more than half of them were women. So in Eastern Europe, the age structure of the communities was drastically altered, as many young men and women were deported to Germany, while others joined the partisans. In Western Europe, on the other hand, gender relations were most affected. The long-term absence of men gave women more independence, but also burdened them with additional responsibilities. They became the sole providers and carers for their families and had to do so under extremely difficult circumstances. And women applied a range of strategies to secure the survival of their families, and this shaped also their behavior towards the occupier. Now, while German invasion drained some societies of young men, and in the East also of young women, it also brought a massive influx of men. Around 350,000 German soldiers were stationed in Norway on average throughout the war, a very high number considering that Norway had a population of 3 million. What does the massive influx of men do to a society? Women suddenly found that the pool of available men had considerably expanded. This inevitably created tensions with local men who felt that these women belonged to them. What happened in societies where many men were absent, like in France? Did the new men take their place as providers or as lovers? Or were the women more vulnerable to exploitation? There are no easy answers to these questions, and we need to carefully study the different contexts in which the interactions took place to understand the varied responses to these changes. A common feature of the occupation was that women entered intimate relationships with the enemy. This produced tensions in some communities and a violent backlash against the women after the war. In other communities, such relationships were deemed acceptable, or they were seen as necessary to survive. For it is evident that women entered relationships with the German enemy for a number of varied reasons. And the same is, by the way, true for men in the occupied societies. Homosexual relations between men and members of the German power were by no means rare, though little studied. Intimate relationships took various forms, ranging from romantic liaisons to more pragmatic, temporary relationships to business-like transactions. As Richard Kopp illustrated for France and Rolfshagen for Norway, the German uniform held considerable attraction for some men and some women. The victor came with the promise of a future, at least early on in the war. Moreover, he was able to provide something others could not. Some found it hard to resist the offer of a delicious meal in an expensive restaurant in the company of a dashing officer in a smart uniform. It is important to remember that occupation builds on an asymmetry of power between the occupiers and the occupied. The German occupiers had the military means to control and subject the population to its rule. The occupied, on the other hand, were robbed of their sovereignty. Their established rights and freedoms were severely curtailed by the new rulers. Since the occupiers now controlled access to vital resources, it was necessary to cooperate with them to a certain degree to secure one's survival. Yet the image of the occupier who holds all the power and the occupied who have no power is false. Reality was much more complex. The occupiers were dependent on local cooperation to administer the country and exploit its resources. Talbot Imlay speaks of an information asymmetry. The locals had information and knowledge that the new rulers needed. Although power rested now with the occupiers and their collaborators, they were never in sole possession of power. Nor was their position ever secure. Under occupation, positions of power were claimed and contested, they were temporarily strengthened or given up. Even under Nazi Germany's brutal dictatorial regime, the divide between allegedly active rulers and allegedly passive ruled was never clear-cut or stable. The asymmetry of power could easily shift when the occupier and the occupied came into closer contact. Civilians could, temporarily usually, strengthen their position of power. Conversely, the German occupier could lose or even voluntarily give up their superior status in closer contact with the occupied. Let us take the example of those Wehrmacht soldiers who deserted. The majority of deserters did not defect to the enemy at the front line. They either went into hiding when they were at home on leave, or they deserted in the hinterland, in the occupied countries. Since the Nazi leadership persecuted deserters mercilessly, they were completely dependent on the help of locals. Without support, a deserter was unable to survive for long. To escape capture, he needed food, civilian clothing, and information. People who helped German deserters undertook considerable risks. Yet at the same time, by extending help to a deserter, the existing hierarchy of power between the occupier and the occupied was completely reversed, if only on a personal level. Because a deserter had excluded himself from the Volksgemeinschaft, as the military courts called it, he had also lost his superior status as occupier. The asymmetry of power was also undermined when soldiers and civilians colluded to steal goods from the Wehrmacht depots, often to sell them on for profit on the black market. Such cases occurred fairly frequently. In places where soldiers and locals worked side by side, a form of dialogue became possible people started to talk to each other, maybe meet for a glass of beer after work or barter goods. And such relations could develop into mutually profitable corporations, like in this example. In a spectacular court case in December 1941, the court of the Kommandantur Oslo sentenced 2 Wehrmacht soldiers to death for misapprehending Wehrmacht property. Also in the dock were 28 Norwegians who worked for the Wehrmacht at Akershus Festning, where equipment for the Wehrmacht was stored and repaired. Only 11 soldiers, amongst them the 2 defendants, had been in charge of overseeing the depots and the 250 Norwegian workers. Now, one of these overseers, Unteroffizier Jakob F., found that he could quite easily remove equipment since control was very lax. According to the written judgment, a Norwegian worker whose excellent German had awarded him a position of trust encouraged him in doing this. He knew potential customers who were eager to buy the stolen goods. So over time, Jakob F., together with a number of his local staff, smuggled large quantities of skis, backpacks, or leather from the Wehrmacht storage and sold them on the black market. Inevitably, other workers got wind of what was going on. Some Norwegians who were working in the oil depot began to siphon off oil in large quantities. Oil was rationed, so it was very difficult to get oil. Their supervisor, Unteroffizier Gerhard did not participate, but he accepted payment for looking the other way. Now, this and similar cases illustrate the fluidity of power relations, especially in spaces where Norwegians and Germans came into frequent contact. The Wehrmacht soldiers held positions of power, both as occupiers and as supervisors, yet the illegal nature of the activities, as well as the Norwegians' cognizance and complicity in the act, made their position increasingly untenable. Both parties were tied together by a shared financial interest, and neither could act without the other. Obviously, such relations were highly risky. For the Germans, they posed a threat to the leadership's position of power and undermined military strength. What can cases like these tell us about everyday life under occupation? They show that even under a repressive regime, people had agency, sometimes considerable agency, as in this example. They were not without power. However, there existed crucial differences. The room to maneuver for individual members of occupied societies varied considerably, depending on context, their social background, and their positioning within the Nazi hierarchy. A Jew in a Polish ghetto who suffered hunger, exploitation, and violence had decidedly fewer opportunities to act than, for example, a Danish pig farmer who did not only profit economically from the occupation due to the high demand for bacon, but was also free or could also move and act more freely. People in the occupied societies were positioned on different levels in the hierarchy of power, and thus their room to maneuver varied greatly. Still, the manifold interactions between people on different sides of the conflict reveal that the occupier's position of power was continuously punctuated by the dependency on local cooperation, as well as by the interactions on the lower everyday level. Living in close proximity, the line between friend and foe became increasingly blurry. How much the citizens of occupied societies interacted with the occupiers varied from region to region. In some regions, people hardly ever encountered a German soldier throughout the war. In other places, they lived on top of each other. The German presence became a part of their daily life, to which one had to adjust in one way or another. I come to the conclusion. So analyzing the relations between the occupier and the occupied helps us to understand how the occupation functioned in practice, how power was produced but also shifted. To understand how people responded to the occupation, we need to look at the wider social context. We cannot study the occupiers and the occupied in isolation, because the worlds overlapped in multiple ways. In focusing our attention to these overlaps, it becomes evident that the line between the enemies was not as clear-cut or static as it appears. Nor can the choices the people made, their often contradictory attitudes and actions, be sufficiently explained by categorizing them as collaboration or resistance. Depending on how narrowly you define the term collaboration or resistance, there are many actions that do not fit into these categories. Furthermore, the concepts of collaboration or resistance are insufficient to make sense of the complex reality of life under occupation, and particularly of the relations between the occupier and the occupied on this lower everyday level. What we perhaps need are, as the Polish historian Jan Gross argued, new middle terms that help to grasp the manifold relations between the enemies. He said we need to rely on middle terms situated maybe between collaboration and resistance in order to make better sense of the experience of war and occupation in 20th century Europe. And with this, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Tusen takk, Maria Fritsche. Da setter du deg i midten, og så overtar Halvard Kjelmeland selve runde. Og dere to som skal kommentere først, kommer nå. Vær så snill. Okay.
Ok. Hører dere meg?
Ja.
Ja, i en krig som varer i 6 år er det ikke bare dramatiske hendinger. Det meste blir rutinisert, det blir hverdag. Og det er ikke for sterkt å si at det er et underkommunisert aspekt ved både norsk og europeisk krigstidshistorie. I Norge var vi så heldige at vi fikk klassikeren på dette feltet av Guri Hjeltnes for 30 år siden i verket Norge i krig, et bind som heter Hverdagsliv. Men i Maria sitt strålende innlegg så har vi fått løftet dette ved å se denne hverdagen, den normaliteten i et europeisk perspektiv, se hvordan hverdagen arter seg ulikt for ulike grupper og ulike kjønn. Og det sier seg selv at dette er et felt der det er mye ugjort, der det er mange spørsmål en kan reise. Og det er jo det vi vil åpne for nå da, at folk kan stille spørsmål, komme med kommentarer. Men for å få fart på dette så har vi altså da 2 kommentatorer som har forberedt innlegg. Patrick Bernhard, som er førsteamanuensis på det historiske instituttet ved Universitetet i Oslo. Han er ekspert på transnasjonal europeisk historie, har jobbet mye med blant annet tysk og italiensk fascisme. Og vi har fått Claudia Lenz, som jobber med MF, Vitenskapelig høgskole her i Oslo, som er ekspert på minnepolitikk og minnehistorie. Hun har tidligere forsket på Holocaust-senter og er nå professor 2 der. Så da er tanken at Claudia starter med sitt innlegg, så fortsetter Patrick, og så åpner jeg for spørsmål og kommentarer, og så kan panelet komme inn når det passer dem. Så da gir jeg ordet til Claudia.
Tusen takk. Den på? Ja. Sånn. Ja. Dette, som du har gitt oss, Maria, vil jeg kalle et kaleidoskop, eller et forskningsprogram. Du begynte med titelen «Hverdag i ekstreme tider», og så har jeg skriblet og notert og variert over den titelen litt. Snakket du om ekstrem hverdag, normalitet og terror, side om side, normalisering av det unormale, eller og en normalitet som brått kunne snu til terror. Så du har gitt oss mange perspektiver som hjelper til å bryte opp. Og min bakgrunn jeg er ikke historiker, jeg er minneforsker. Og jeg har hørt mange fortellinger om krigen i private hjem. Og da går det mange myter også om hva hverdagen under krigen var. Og de blir veldig gjerne ganske ensrettet. Det var enten det ene, eller det var det andre. Og som du sier, det fanns jo også posisjoner under tysk okkupasjon som var enten det ene eller det andre. Noen, som du sa, så knapt til en tysk soldat, eller opplevde noe forskjell, og noen opplevde tider med kontinuerlig mareritt. Men det som jeg synes er det mest interessante, og det som jeg tenker utgjør et potensielt forskningsprogram, det er jo det komparative. Å se hvordan virkeligheten under tysk okkupasjon både varierte systematisk langs de samme kategoriene, eller analytiske kategoriene som man kunne anvende. Du nevnte klasse, alder, kjønn, by, land. Men på tvers av dette selvfølgelig spørsmål hvor i rasehierarkien var man plassert. Både geografisk, Øst-Europa, Nordvest-Europa, men også innenfor det samme samfunn. Så det å bruke disse kategoriene og perspektivene systematisk i et komparativt prosjekt, og pakke ut for hvem kunne egentlig virkeligheten under tysk okkupasjon arte seg som en normalitet, som noe hverdagslig, eller for hvem kunne det maksimalt bli en normalisering av det unormale, av en konstant trussel, som til enhver tid kunne sny til det marerittartige. Du viste hostage-gisselskytingene. Der ser man på en måte hvordan det var side om side. Det var en normalitet, men den kunne til enhver tid endre seg og sny. Hvor og under hvilke omstendigheter var disse relasjonene, som du så veldig bra beskrev. Jeg har igjen notert hvilke posisjoner i relasjon okkupant og okkupert kunne vi egentlig finne i ditt foredrag. Ja, du kunne ha fiende, du kunne ha konsument, kunde, du kunne ha nabo, du kunne være kollega, du kunne være kjæreste. Og i all disse tilsynelatende normale betegnelser over relasjoner, it's lingering, det unormale. Den maktforhandling som du beskriver, at selv om det er en kunderelasjon, eller nabo- eller kollegarelasjon, er det ikke normalitet. selv om det tilsynelatende ser ut som. Og da kommer det andre. Hvor i det rasehierarkiet befant man seg? Hvor trygt, hvor stabil kunne disse tilsynelatende normalitetene egentlig være? Så som sagt, dette tror jeg kan man ønske deg å få en forskergruppe på plass som forsker på dette europeisk sammenlignende. Jeg skal bare avslutte og si noe om de mest overraskende momentene som jeg fikk med meg. Og det ene er jo dette med kjedsomhet under krigen. At når vi tenker hverdag under krig, da tenker vi det dramatiske, men at faktisk hverdagsliv under krig, både for de okkuperte og for okkupantene, betydde i lange strekninger ofte veldig mye kjedsomhet. Og så selvfølgelig, som kjønnsforsker selv, synes jeg jo at det å gå dypere inn i disse handlingsrommene for kvinnene, som du har beskrevet, som var alt annet enn frivillig. De var, som du også sa, en belastning, men samtidig dette klisjé, det skjønnete i relasjonene mellom okkupert og okkupant, da tror jeg det er veldig stor behov og potensiale for videre forskning, fordi det er min innsikt fra minneforskning at de variasjonene i hvordan kvinnene brukte dette handlingsrommet, de forsvant veldig fort etter krigen, fordi det var en så stor behov for en normalisering også av kjønnsrelasjonene i etterkrig, at nettopp det som på en måte kvinnene hadde vært annet enn enten offer eller kjæreste, det har forsvunnet i veldig stor grad. Så det håper jeg virkelig det blir mye mer forskning av. Tusen takk.
Ja, da får Patrick anledning til å ha et 5 minutters innlegg, og så åpner jeg da opp for spørsmål og kommentarer.
Is that yours?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Someone left notes here. These are not my notes. Okay. Yeah, great many thanks for this very kind invite. Even greater thanks to Maria for this fantastic talk. I'm happy to be here. At the same moment, I'm slightly embarrassed. I have just realized that I'm now the third person of German language to give a talk about occupation, Nazi occupation. I've immediately decided to really cut my comment very short to give you the opportunity to have a word here in this story as well. As I said already, Maria, this was really a very, very nice talk. I think you, in a way, circled the square. Yeah, you gave a very clear talk, at the same time a very nuanced one, rich of details. You talked about the realities of occupation, yeah, the differences. Yeah, you made a strong point in making the point that we really have to differentiate between various realities. You used the word normalities, and I was very much fond of that. Yeah, you even scrutinized the very idea of normality. Yeah, I think we always have to keep in mind that normality is what we declare as such. Yeah, and when we discuss normalities, we at the same time create blind spots. Yeah, it is normal. We take it for granted. We do not analyze it any further. Yeah, so great many thanks for that. You also provided us here with the big picture, yeah, a broad array of topics from violence to food, or the lack of food, from schooling to movie going. Yeah? This is really a plethora of topics addressed. You also used various categories of analysis that mattered to have a better understanding of Nazi occupation, yeah? Religion, ideology, but also demographics. And I particularly liked what you had to say about children. I mean, you might know that historians have increasingly engaged in the history of childhood, but as far as I know, you are one of the first to link the history of childhood with the history of occupation. Yeah? So that is an interesting recombination. As I said before, I will try to keep myself short here. That means I will just address two aspects. I will refrain from talking about violence, because that would probably become otherwise a very long comment. Two aspects that I would like to make. As I said before, you used a lot of categories to make sense of Nazi occupation. However, I missed one, and that is colonialism. You might know that since Mark Mazauer's seminal work on Nazi empire, historians have become increasingly interested in understanding Nazi rule in Eastern Europe as a form of colonialism, an extreme form of settler colonialism. Yeah? You might also know that millions of Germans were supposed to be resettled in Poland and parts of Russia. So my question would be, why didn't you talk about colonialism, yeah? As a category? Just to give you some background information, it was actually that the Nazis themselves constantly talked about Eastern Europe as a new India, as a colonial space. They even addressed the indigenous population as white Negroes. Yeah? That was kind of a trope in Nazi propaganda. I know that you want to focus in your work, in your future work, more on Norway. I assume maybe the language of colonialism did not matter that much, but I would nevertheless encourage you to still raise it as a problem. Yeah? And I mean, you talked so much about different realities of occupation, and I was wondering, are there also different languages of occupation? Yeah? That colonial language was used in certain areas and others not, and what does that say about occupation as such? Okay, that is my first point. The second point is the effects of occupation. I mean, you made a very strong point again in telling us that occupation fundamentally changed societies during the occupation. What I would be even more interested is in the long-term impact of occupation. You talked about, for instance, Norwegians having as far as I could understand it, a rather positive experience when it comes to German authority. I found that very interesting. So my question was, or would be, in how far did this experience alter the Norwegian experience with authorities, with the state, with police? Yeah. So, and the second one, I think that comes very close to what Claudia has addressed, and that would be sexual relations, yeah, and the long-term effects of these sexual relations. So my question would actually again be, in what ways did the experience of German occupation change how Norwegians thought about sexuality? Yeah, and that would mean also how do we have to position the history of the occupation in a wider history of, let's say, the history of sexuality in Norway in the modern period. Yeah, so it would really be about to encourage you to think a little bit more about or take a long-term perspective. Yeah, I mean, we're so much used to talk about, these, what is it, 6 years of occupation. That I think that was the case with most European countries occupied by Germans, and to think a little bit more in broader terms. Yeah, so could we do something along the lines of the longue durée, yeah, of occupation? Yeah, in what way did it really matter in the end? So, okay, that's it from my side. I hope it was not too long.
Ja, der har vi fått en god opptak til diskusjonen. Nå har det jo allerede blitt stilt spørsmål til Maria, som gjelder spørsmål om normalitetsbegrepet, som gjelder spørsmål om kolonialismebegrepets relevans, om langtidsvirkninger. Men jeg tror ikke du skal svare på det nå. Nå skal vi sette i gang publikum litt, og så får du heller samle opp litt og komme tilbake til disse spørsmålene. Så da gir jeg ordet fritt. Ja. Jeg tror at alle som tar ordet bruker mikrofon og så presenterer seg.
Ja, mitt navn Mosland, og jeg en 1932-modell og har gjennomlevet krigen fra 9. april 1940, da tyskerne angrep Kristiansand, og denne ble plukket opp i gaten like utenfor. Så det var starten. Denne presentasjonen som har blitt gitt, synes jeg har vært på sitt hovedpunkt korrekt og god. Men den veldig ensidig når man snakker om okkupasjonen. De tyske troppene oppførte seg, må jeg si, eksemplarisk. Men hvor jeg bodde, så var det ikke comme il faut å ha noe videre kontakt med dem. Men de var høflige, og de oppførte seg pent. Men det som ikke berørt, Gestapo, SS, angivervirksomheten, tortur. Det står i en oversikt fra en bok fra punkter fra krigen fra 1944 at fangenummer 14.800 passert på Grini. Hittil 259 personer henrettet. Det skrekkvelde som vi levde igjennom, det kontrollvelde, vi fikk jo ikke, jeg bodde ikke i Kristiansand det meste, jeg bodde i Farsund på Lista, hvor det var vel en befolkning på ca. 2000, og på det meste 4000 tyske tropper. Men det kontrollregimet, vi fikk ikke lov til å reise uten å ha politiets tilladelse. Rasjoneringen var slik at jeg måtte sendes på landet 2 sommerferier for å fetes opp. Alle disse tingene hører også med til en okkupasjon. Jeg har mye mer, men dette begynnelsespunktene. Det hovedsakelig den andre siden, det tyske hemmelige politi, Gestapo, SS, nazi, innvirkningen med anmeldinger. Man kunne aldri føle seg sikker på hvem man kunne snakke åpent med, hvis ikke man kjente det. Så skrekkveldet har du glemt.
Ja, det ingen andre som har meldt seg hittil, og da synes jeg kanskje jeg skal gi ordet til Maria, for hun har fått utfor... Ok, da det et innlegg. Da har jeg 2 innlegg.
Hallo, ja. Jeg heter Astrid Sveen, og jeg et 61-modell. Datter av en tysk mor som var krigsbarn, og av en norsk far som opplevde okkupasjonen. Og jeg synes faktisk jeg takker dere veldig for dette innspill. Jeg her fordi jeg som veldig mange andre tyskere, bearbeider krigshistorien. Vi gjør det jo i hver vår generasjon, og derfor var det litt interessant å oppdage at det tyskere som forsker, og jeg veldig takknemlig for det. Jeg jobber med flyktninger, og jeg har sett i andre land som okkupert, blant annet i Kongo, eller har vært okkupert av ulike grunner, at det lignende temaer. Det slår meg. Det det første. Det andre at her det, altså jeg har bodd i Norge i 35 år. Jeg kom på 80-tallet. Min mor kom for første gang på 60-tallet. Vi opplevde det veldig forskjellig. Og mitt spørsmål hvordan en okkupasjonserfaring påvirker synet på okkupantens nasjon i ettertid og omvendt. Fordi hvis vi snakker om hvordan utviklingen i dag i Europa, og den gjensidige forståelsen mellom disse ulike landene, og du nevnte Hellas. I Hellas og Serbia har jeg forstått følelsene mot Tyskland og tyskere enda sterkere enn det kanskje delvis av og til har vært i Norge mange år tilbake. Og jeg tenker liksom hvordan den type erfaring påvirker hvordan vi i dag samhandler, snakker sammen, utvikler politikk, bekjemper høyreekstreme eller nazistiske strømninger. Kort fortalt, det mye mer jeg kunne kommentert.
Ja. Da det en til som har meldt seg frem til nå, det Knut Kjeldstadli, han får ordet, og så selv om det melder seg flere, så får Maria anledning til å svare på det som har kommet så langt.
Nei, du snakket om behovet for, helt på slutten av innlegget ditt, behovet for mellomkategorier. Så jeg lurer på, hvordan kan man utvikle den tanken videre? Liksom mellom aktiv kollaborasjon, som man gjør med glede, positivt, enten det profitt eller ideologi, versus en de facto samarbeid. Eller hvordan det med liksom de som aktive i en eller annen type motstand, versus en strategi rett og slett for å dukke ned og holde seg unna det meste så langt det går. Så jeg lurer på, hva ditt forslag? Du må ha tenkt på en del kategorier, vil jeg tro.
Ja, da tar jeg ett innlegg til for Maria, og eventuelt de to andre paneler også får anledning til å kommentere det. Det var et innlegg bak der.
Engelsjøen, og jeg vil takke alle som har hatt ordet for veldig interessante innlegg. 61-modellen pekte på et veldig viktig problem, og jeg vil ta utgangspunkt i at den tyske okkupasjonen i Norge, de hadde silkehanske og stålklo. Norske offiserer som overga seg kunne mot å avgi æresord på ikke å fortsette kampen, slippe fri, mens kampene fremdeles foregikk lenger opp i landet. Det som skjedde, de første henrettelsene var jo Wikström og Hansten, etter at Heydrich hadde vært oppe i Norge og sagt antagelig til Terboven og diverse stram dere opp. Vi kan ikke ha melkestreiker gående i Norge. Claudia Lenz kom inn på dette skillet mellom det som skjedde i Øst-Europa og det som skjedde i Nord-Europa. Og det jeg savner, det en ideologisering av den andre verdenskrig. Jeg savner selvfølgelig også en ideologisering av oppgjøret. Fienden her i Norge var tyskerne, ikke tyske nazister. Det burde ha vært tyske nazister, norske nazister, altså nazismen og kollaboratørene. Det som veldig viktig her, at den andre verdenskrig kanskje ikke var en sånn omfordelingskrig som vi hadde sett omtrent hvert 10 år i Europa og ellers. Den var noe mer. Den var ikke bare det at tyskere og nordmenn som samarbeidet med dem skulle få bosette seg i øst. Det var en generalplan øst som forutsatte likvidasjon av titalls millioner mennesker. Disse litt klønete, håpløse tyske soldatene som kom til Norge, de hadde jo ikke bevissthet om at de bana veien for innsatsgrupper. I Norge hadde vi særkommandoer. Det var snakk om Gestapo. Og på østfronten så drepte de i løpet av et halvt år et par millioner jøder. Altså, det var den andre verdenskrig. Jeg vil gjerne ha en kommentar til det. Takk.
Ja, takk skal du ha. Da skal Maria få slippe til. Og så kan Patrick og Claudia også komme inn med kommentarer hvis de har behov for det. Og så er det fritt frem for å melde seg. Jeg skal prøve å få med meg de som rekker opp hånda. Men da gir jeg ordet til Maria.
Jeg tror jeg må ta det på engelsk på farten. So I will go through the commentaries first and then about the question. So thank you very much for your input. And I think if I understood you correctly, you make a difference between normality and normalization. And that is perhaps what is a normality, and is it like terror and violence just becomes in a way normalized, and that's for you a crucial difference, that you don't quite agree with my description maybe or definition of normality, but what is normalized, what becomes normal?
As an analytical category.
And I think that is very useful to look at this sort of the normalization of life. I didn't make all the notes, I'm sorry. And yes, I would like to have a big research group to undertake this research. I think we have to, especially for the German occupation, we have to go beyond national inquiries and look at the wider picture to find out what is similar and where are the differences, what is specific to, for example, Norway and other countries, and what is similar. I think what was also important is about the racial hierarchy, and this is so evident when we look at Eastern Europe, how people were treated very differently and perhaps not even considered people at all, and this is where I have your argument about colonialism. And I agree with you that maybe this is a useful way to look at the policy in Eastern Europe, but is it really colonialism, or is it, as you say, the language of colonialism? So is the practice different from the language? Do they pretend we are colonizing Eastern Europe, but in fact what they do is not like in the colonies in Africa, you try to develop people and educate them. That colonization has also this impetus of moving societies to a higher level, and you can think about that whatever you want. But if you exterminate people, that's not a colonization. But that's something we have to discuss.
We have to discuss, yeah. Yeah, because I think we have to be aware of the fact that there are various forms of colonialism again. Yeah? And settler colonialism is usually seen as ultra-violent, yeah? With genocidal tendencies as well. So, yeah, because when we talk about colonialism, we always have in mind, you know, the good examples, France and Britain. Yeah? And this, I think this is a kind of an idealized way of talking about colonialism in the first place. Yeah? So, yeah.
We will discuss
we
more.
We have to discuss that, yeah.
But of course, what is very important, and this was also the question here, so the long-term impact, we cannot stop with the occupation 1944, 1945, when the German army moved back, and that was the end of the occupation, and so this was done and solved. But we have to take the long-term perspective and look at what is the long-term impact. Of course, this, especially when we look at Eastern Europe, as I also said in my talk, we can question, did the German occupation, if you put it in comparison to the for many Eastern European, the German occupation was immediately replaced by the Soviet occupation. So this is not something, it changed character. And the German occupation, looking back, is a fairly short period of time. So what is specific to the German occupation, what is specific to the Soviet occupation, and what is the impact on this? So this is very complicated. But I agree with you that we definitely have to look, and if you're talking about minne culture, what is the impact on societies? And
I would like to link on your comment, because I think if we look into the particular racialized experience, both on the side of the occupiers as on the side of the occupied, it's quite a different to be met with an idea of being like the Norwegian were Aryans or being dehumanized. And I think this left quite long traces, which probably were under-communicated and not possible in the East-West constellation, and maybe also covered up by the quite quick political cooperation in Western Europe after the Second World War. What kind of traces did this leave in the encounter of people, and also even beyond some generations? So I may be not completely agreeing that the ordinary soldiers came completely innocent and didn't know, while the villains were the Gestapo and the SS, because, as my former boss Harald Welzer said, there was a frame of reference. The racial pattern of thinking was a frame of reference also for these ordinary soldiers. And I think it was very interesting that you showed how this was tamed in a way also by the occupational regime and by the military justice, for example.
Yeah, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And I think we see it in Poland with the debates going on, that the German occupation and also the Soviet occupation has left a deep impact on these societies. And it's very, very, the tensions very quickly flare up. And we have seen it with Greece, with the question of, well, what did Germany actually do to, apart from paying a little bit of money, what did they actually do to put past wrong things right again? And that is, again, something that is not really discussed very much even today. So I think that is very important. Your criticism, and you're totally correct, that in my talk, although in my view I talked a lot about the brutality and repression and violence of occupation, but maybe you got the impression that all the bad things happened in Eastern Europe and on the Balkans, whereas in Norway it was more or less a joyous affair, which of course it was not. And I'm sorry that you got this impression of me, because of course you're right. There was this constant. People lived in a very fragile situation, and that's something you mentioned too. Even if you had sort of normal relations to the occupying soldiers, there was always, as you said, lingering back this fear. What could happen? It can change any minute, because he's still the occupier and he has more power. And of course you have this you have the threats of, you have the repression of your of free movement and of your rights. You have the Gestapo. You have the threat of being arrested and sent to camp, of even being killed. And you have the same here in Norway. But what I would like to say is that this constant threat was maybe not experienced the same by everybody in Norway. There was, first of all, a different level of threat, and maybe not all people felt the same way about it, is my question. If I understood you correctly, you're referring to the last slide about the collaboration and resistance, and whether I have I can offer something, some more productive terms. And again, we have this huge debate about collaboration and resistance, and in what way are they useful or not useful, and especially when we talk about the social history of the occupation, I don't find them very useful to explain how people behaved and how they acted. Because in this context, collaboration and resistance very quickly become very static and very moral terms. And I'm not saying that collaboration did not exist or resistance did not exist, but if you want to understand the people and how people acted, and often very contradictory, they did not, we have many different shades between these two outer brackets of collaboration and resistance. The one is very positive loaded, the other is very negative. And we have many different shades in between. And these were also not static. So what did people really do? How did people act? And how can we understand them? And for this, I find them not very useful. So I'm in line with Jan Gross, otherwise I wouldn't have cited him. The question is whether I have something better to offer, and I'm afraid, making a long talk short, I have not yet found a good alternative. And this is, of course, not a very good answer. Otherwise, I would have presented it to you and say, this is the terms I offer. I think we're all still looking for the new terms. And I'm afraid I haven't quite understood your question. That was the last person who so can you maybe say it again, the question you had?
Okay. I would like you more to emphasize the ideological part of the Second World War, and how that is different from other wars Europe had experienced so far.
Okay.
The ideology being the Generalplan Ost, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry that I didn't understand it. Yeah, I know now what you mean. And of course, if we talk about Nazi ideology and the occupation, of course, the whole German occupation was driven and based on Nazi ideology. As you said, the whole expansion into the East and the extermination of millions of people, as I also mentioned in my talk, was a calculated decision. These people are expendable. We don't need them, and we don't want them because they are inferior to our master plan of finding new living space for the Germans in the East, which is also, of course, the breadbasket of Europe. So this was really and here we have again the connection with colonialism, of course.
Yeah, so can be seen as a colonial plan. Yeah,
it's a colonial plan, but of course heavily influenced by Nazi ideology, which has this very strange racial hierarchy of categorizing people according to supposedly scientific, which of course it isn't, supposedly scientific categories. And this influenced the whole occupation, and this is why we have the differences, of course, between Western Europe and a different quality of occupation policy in Western and in Northern Europe compared to Eastern and Southern Europe. But I think I would need a another hour or a new talk to focus on this. I have to remind you that I had 1 hour to talk about everyday experience of occupation in Europe, and this is quite a large topic already. So I do understand that you all feel frustrated that there are specific factors I did not emphasize enough in your views.
Ja, og nå har vi bare et kvarter igjen, så vi må begrense diskusjonen litt. Jeg har 3 innlegg, og jeg setter strek under neste innlegg, som får avrunde i rett tid. Og den første som skal ha innlegg Guri Hjeltnes.
Thank you, Maria. It's fabulous to listen to you, and I do hope there will be the research group. I'll join it, and I think many will do. But as you know, there is actually, I think this comparative perspective is really important, and I'm quite sure you know the work of Tatjana Tönsmeier and Peter Hasling and Laba, which a book came at Palgrave last year on coping with hunger and shortage under German occupation in World War II. And that is actually important to mention because it examines individual and group strategy for overcoming drastic shortages, but it also deals with a lot of other topics. And that is actually, it shows what you actually emphasized, the massive difference between the old Eastern Europe and Western Europe, because the life was so different. It's really complicated to make comparisons because it's such, I mean, Norway, the occupation in Norway is quite different from Poland, Hungary, you name it. It's so many differences. So that is a question I have for you is hverdagsliv. I mean, actually you had it in Norwegian, you had it in hverdagsliv, ekstreme tider. And in your English title, I think it's just the relation between the occupier and occupier. So I have to challenge you if this term everyday life is fruitful. I mean, I understand your extreme times, the hverdagsliv, ekstreme timer, but you know, sometimes in some countries it was ordinary day, everyday life and ordinary life. I mean, it was not extreme all the time. And then I have detail, and that is, which is really interesting, and that is, you said, that is, and we have Per Ole Johansen here, who's been working on this field for many years, but you said that you found no confirmation for the claim of death sentence in your sources. What does that mean? Does it mean that the research on this field has been not good enough, or is it actually the sources you've been through? I mean, you've been going into course, you understand you have been working on the court. I mean, if you read, if you follow the Meldungen aus Norwegen, which I've seen many of, I mean, I have found so few examples of assaults and, say, rape. How is this landscape actually? What is your opinion about that?
Du noterer spørsmålet, og så går vi videre, så du samler opp, for ellers så får vi problem med tida, tror jeg. Jeg har lys imot meg, så jeg kjenner ikke igjen uten videre alle som ber om ordet. Du I hvit skjorte der, hva om ordet?
Yes, thank you. I'm Hans-Petter Graver at the University of Oslo. Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk. And I find one question which you touched upon and which has also been touched upon by others really intriguing, and that is the question of the long-term effects. But of course, when you ask that question, you have to specify it, the long-term effects of what on what. I mean, in a sense, it's a long-term effect that we're having the discussion here now on the German occupation. So I at least think that we have to distinguish at least between long-term effects on Norwegian social and political institutions and structures on the one hand, and on individual lives on the other hand. And we also have to, I think, specify the long-term effects of structures, organization, actions, and individuals on the German side in Norway during the 5 years. I think the long-term effects they had on some individuals' lives, of course, were profound, whereas perhaps the long-term effects on Norwegian social and political organization perhaps wasn't that great. But then, of course, you have the long-term effects of the Norwegian structures and institutions and actions both during and also after the occupation. And these had, I think, in many ways profound long-term effects on Norwegian society. But it would be very interesting to investigate, I think, more, particularly the long-term effects of the German side in Norway. That's been very under-investigated, I think.
Ja. Takk skal du ha. Nok et stort spørsmål som så stort at jeg tror du også må ta det avslutningsvis. For vi har to innlegg til. Jeg har ikke notert meg flere. Det han Øystein, du vet, og så det en person bak her. Har jeg da oversett noen? Nei. Så da det Hetland.
Returning to this last slide of yours. Last year a book came out which really neatly summarized the war in that, saying that no one really came out clean. And this, I don't know at which point this weird thing that there was collaboration and there were not collaboration came into being, because during the war everyone collaborated in some way. So in our research project on the Holocaust Center, we tried to sort of take this into consideration and say that this is not a question about whether or not you collaborated, because everyone collaborated in some way. By living above ground, you collaborated with the occupier just to survive. The question is, why did you do it? Because, and this is interesting, because after the war, your collaboration was usually viewed not so much by what you did, but why you did it. So if what we suggested was basically there are 4 types of collaboration. It's forced collaboration. The most extreme example is, of course, Jews working in the concentration camps, in the Sonderkommandos picking out gold from bodies because they fear that they know that otherwise they will be killed. And then what we call pragmatic collaboration, sort of the logic of the lesser evil. If we don't do it, then the Germans are going to do it themselves, and that's going to be worse for everyone. And an opportunistic collaboration, which is what can I benefit from this? How can I benefit from the collaboration? But not without, being a Nazi as such. And at the end, ideological collaboration. People who supported the occupiers because they shared their ideological views. Why is this important? Because after the war, particularly in Norway, people were judged according to these categories. So if you collaborated, built stuff for the Germans, but did it because you thought it was a lesser evil, you just usually got off the hook. But if you did it to enrich yourself, you were often sentenced. So after the war, in Norwegian court records, for instance, it's obvious that everyone knew that everyone collaborated in some way. So if everyone collaborates, how can you judge someone? By asking, why did you do it? Not that so much that you actually did it, because everyone collaborated in some way.
Ja, takk skal du ha. Da du siste mann. Du får mikrofonen her.
Takk skal du ha. Mitt navn Per Ole Johansen, og jeg kriminolog og politihistoriker. Jeg har lyst til å kommentere spørsmålet om langtidseffektene i den norske befolkning med hensyn til holdning til staten. Jeg synes det spørsmålet var veldig godt, særlig fordi jeg ikke helt enig. For det første så må man spørre om nordmenn hadde tiltro til tyskere, selv om de kontaktet tyske myndigheter for å få sin rett. Kanskje de bare forsøkte å bruke de mulighetene de trodde at de hadde. Det det ene spørsmålet. Ellers det avhengig av hvilke type tyske instanser vi snakker om, selvfølgelig. Schnellkommando versus Gestapo jo 2 vidt forskjellige ansikter. Norske politifolk har fortalt meg at de advarte nordmenn mot å kontakte tyskere i det hele tatt. Dessuten så var det jo en stor frustrasjon blant nordmenn, og det viser Statspolitiets arkiver. Det var en stor frustrasjon blant nordmenn som anmeldte saker som Statspolitiet tok opp med tyske myndigheter, fordi de så aldri resultatet av det. Det var end of the story. Ellers, kort sagt, efter enhver krig så det store bekymringer for hva som skjer med soldatene når de kommer hjem. Fighting societies, skal gjøres siviliserte, og det er ikke alltid like lett. Og det kan også i mange kriger være en gråzone mellom kriminalitet og motstandsarbeid, som vi også så i Norge. Politiet mistet prestisje under krigen. Og la meg til slutt bare nevne Norge etter første verdenskrig, hvor nordmenn var så lei av stat og vedtekter og regler at de virkelig gikk i konservativ retning. Da gikk hugen til dans og drinker i skogen, og ikke mer stat og ikke mer autoritet. Til slutt, når det gjelder Guri Hjeltnes spørsmål, så la meg veldig kort nevne at jeg har studert politiarkiver en del år, og særlig statspolitis arkiver. Og det er klart, da ser man jo også andre bilder enn den anstendige tysker. Den er der absolutt, men det var tyskere som var arrogante. Det var tyskere som var veldig nervøse og lengtet hjem, og så var det tyskere som misforstod de norske kodene. Så vi har mange saftige eksempler, men de får vi ta en annen gang.
Takk skal du ha, ja. Jeg tror at alle tre skal få lov til å komme med en kort sluttkommentar, og kanskje selv da Maria som har fått direkte spørsmål. Men jeg tar det i motsatt rekkefølge, det vil si at vi starter med Patrick, fortsetter med Claudia, og så avslutter med Maria. Så Patrick, du får da anledning til, you have the word.
Okay, yeah, I will make it very brief and maybe come back to the idea of comparison. You mentioned that it's very difficult because Eastern and Western Europe were so different. And I would like to render that more of a problem because I think the comparison itself can be a problem. Yeah? And when we look at how we thought about violence during occupation, yeah, we still tend to make a huge difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Of course, there were differences. The problem is when you look at scholarly accounts of violence, and there is always also, or there has been, a political agenda, yeah? Especially by conservative German military historians to create also differences, huge differences. Yeah? They admitted that, of course, even members of the Wehrmacht committed horrendous crimes in Eastern Europe. At the same time, they tried to exclude Western Europe, yeah, from that picture, basically saying this was still a normal war. Yeah? Germans stuck to conventional forms of warfare. That went to the point that Peter Lieb even claimed that basically there were no war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht. So that is, the comparison can also be, I would argue, a means to exonerate, yeah? Violence events. So I think we should also be aware of that, yeah? Of the history of comparisons, because that took place and has taken place in a very specific political, ideological context after 1945. So I think that is something we have to take also into account. Yeah? And I would be a little bit cautious by comparing everything to what happened in the occupied parts of Russia, yeah? Because then you have a benchmark against which everything pales, yeah. And in this way, I mean, I usually very much like the idea of comparing, but why not use the experience of the respective societies under occupation that they had in their country before 1939 as the true measuring stick, yeah? And then maybe we would come to a different conclusion, maybe even in the case of Norway, yeah? People would probably have experienced, yeah, violence as unprecedented, yeah? So that would be a different way of conceptualizing such a history of violence.
Takk skal du ha. Da det Claudia.
I would like to give it a try with the middle concepts. And I switched to English because everything I find is from English conceptual frameworks, which come from related studies of suppression, for example, racist, colonial suppression. And there we have the same dilemmas of not relativizing everything, but not denying agency, like the complete victimization of the victors when we operate in heroes and villains and resistance and collaboration. So what is often used there is agency, to explore spaces of agency and strategies of agency, and then use this framework against the racialization. How were these spaces of agency and the possible strategies and these negotiations, even if it were power asymmetries and it was not a negotiation at the I hate, but as you showed, it was subtle power negotiations going on. So I think this could be a way of exploring the historical situations and use it in a comparative way, and maybe against that kind of benchmark you have indicated, how did spaces of agency for some even expand in the Norwegian context, and in other contexts for nobody they really expanded, but what kind of strategies and for whom could be applied. And I think this would be a more productive way, because it would be less moralizing than the concepts you said are not sufficient.
Yeah.
På norsk det ville være handlingsrom og handlingsstrategier. Altså det at å snakke om aktører og hvordan de brukte sitt handlingsrom og utvidet sitt handlingsrom, eller opplevde at det ble forminsket.
Takk skal du ha. Da får Maria siste ord.
No, I think, but that is actually what everyday historians do. Historians who are doing Alltagsgeschichte, everyday history, are interested in agency. How much agency do people have? And of course, there is a huge difference, as I said, depending on the context, on how much room to maneuver you have. You cannot demand from somebody, from a child in a Polish ghetto, to act the same way as a grown-up in Western Europe living under. Each person has a different kind of agency, and we need to look at the social context, which is very important. But because Guri asked me what is the purpose of Hverdag's Historia, it's exactly to look at this. How do people actually act in reality? How do they deal with it? What do you do when you live in a country that is occupied by the enemy? And you don't know what's going to happen, and you live in this state of insecurity, and you have to sort of find your way, and it's not always you think like, I'm against the occupying power, yes, but I still have to live. So how do I act? And that's where agency is crucially important. I have your suggestion with these 4 different terms of collaboration. I have personally a problem with that, because, of course, if you use collaboration in its neutral sense, which means just cooperation, but if everything is collaboration or cooperation, for me it loses, it's no longer useful, even if you make this distinction of being forced collaborator or an ideological collaborator. I have this problem with it. If everything is the same, then it misses its value for me. But maybe we can discuss that. I just tried to go briefly. With regard to Per Ole, the tillit, so the trust in the authorities, which I highlighted, what does it mean if people actually report an offense or a crime and go to either to the Norwegian police, and the Norwegian police goes to the military authorities, or they go directly to it, as I have found quite many cases. In my view, it tells me something about how people perceive the German authorities. Maybe they have the perception at that time, and obviously they were right to have this perception, that the Germans will do something about it. They can be trusted. And in some occupied territories, people, for very good reason, no longer have this trust in the authorities. Because not only will the perpetrators not go or will be punished, but maybe something even worse happens. But here in Norway, and I see this especially with property offenses, when soldiers steal something or take something, Norwegians did go to the German authorities and say, hey, this soldier did this and this, and the military authorities investigated for very good reason. Of course, they had an ideological purpose. We want to be friendly. It was especially in the beginning of the occupation. We want to show that we can be trusted. So I think this reporting is very important. It probably has changed over the course of the war. And what you tell me about the police, that they had a very different view of cooperation also with the military authorities. So there is, of course, a level of experience. How do you deal with the Germans? Can you trust them? Are they reliable or not? Hans-Peter, yes, we discussed this briefly today with the long-term effects, and we both agreed that, for example, if we look at the judiciary, we think the long-term effect on Norway is marginal at best. But where we, of course, if we just stay in Norway, the long-term effect, we have the economic long-term effect. If we take the train or drive a car, we see it every day. The occupation did leave an impact on Norway. No, not even thinking about society as a whole. Traumatic experiences, but also more positive experiences, so different experiences. But there we have to distinguish, of course, which institutions, which actors are we talking about in order to... Also, the other way around, it's not just that the occupier influences the occupied, but of course there might be a transmission which goes the other way around, depending on the institutions or organizations you're looking at. But the research we have for the moment is mostly on the level of economy, and here we find that it had quite a deep impact on Norwegian economy, and possibly also in other countries. Yes, Guri, with the quote, what I said about, I found in my source, I meant my sources. And my sources, I didn't define what my sources are, they don't belong to me. But I'm currently investigating court records by the Wehrmacht courts, so the German military courts, and Norwegian civilians were also subjected to German military courts, in theory up to 1942, but in practice much longer. And here I found some sexual assaults, but I never found any example of a harsh sentence like a death sentence in none of the cases. So that's why I said this image, and I don't know where this image comes from. Maybe it comes from Meldungen aus Norwegen, or maybe it comes from other courts where German soldiers who raped a Norwegian woman. I've heard these stories, but I have yet to find empirical evidence that German soldiers were sentenced to death for that. I have not found it personally, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So.
Ja, takk skal du ha. Jeg synes dette har vært et strålende møte. Jeg fikk mange tanker, blant annet spørsmål om hva grunnlag vi sammenlikner på, som jeg har tenkt å grunne nærmere på. Og så vidt jeg kan forstå, så det opplegg for flere forskningsprosjekt som springer ut av dette møtet. Så da det tid for å takke. De to kommentatorene, de skal få sin takk etter møtet på behørig vis. Men hovedpersonen skal få en spesiell gave fra arrangøren. Til Maria. Vær så god.
Takk skal du ha.
Ja.
Takk.
Ja.
Takk for moderasjon.
Og takk til alle som har bidratt.